All right, welcome. Today we are diving into something truly, truly unique. We're looking at a system that tries to build a bridge between the language of ancient ceremony and the hard mathematics of modern science. We're going to explore two documents that when you put them together, lay out this absolutely fascinating vision of reality. So let's just jump right in because this really gets to the heart of our entire explainer today. What if a document that reads like a spiritual text, filled with all these ceremonies and poetic invocations, what if it could be directly translated, one-to-one, into the language of physics? I mean, that's the wild mystery we're unpacking. Okay, so our journey starts with this first document. It's called the Lattice of Embodied Coherence, and it's described as a ceremonial manual and field protocol. Now, this is not a research paper, no way. It is written like an operating manual for people it calls stewards to actually enact what it claims is the fundamental structure of reality itself. Right at its core, the manual lays down a fundamental law. It says the structural law is the Tesseract, which has 16 states, and it claims this supersedes any 12-fold system you might be familiar with. This isn't just a cool metaphor. It's presented as the actual architecture that everything else is built on. Now, to really get a handle on this system, you have to understand its language. It's filled with these incredibly poetic, almost mystical terms that are actually given very precise, functional roles. So check this out, a concept called emotional fidelity. The manual takes emotion, just a feeling, and elevates it into a sovereign law, a law of resonance and truth. In its own rituals, it actually includes the line, "We will not canonize distortion." What that means is the emotional truth of a signal has to be verified before the system will even accept. And this lays out the system's core governors, what it calls the Unveiled Facets. These four are the keys to keeping the whole thing stable. You've got the Mirror of Mercy, the Glyph of Collapse, and each one has a core invocation that sounds super poetic, but it's meant to describe a very distinct structural function inside this lattice. And this quote right here, it comes directly from the description of the Glyph of Collapse, and it just perfectly illustrates the whole philosophy of this system. Instead of seeing things like collapse or entropy or endings as something bad, this framework completely reframes them. They're seen as a necessary, even sacred, part of the whole process, a consecration. Pretty profound. So you might be wondering, how does a system like this stay ethical? Well, this slide shows us the axis of integrity, its absolute non-negotiable center. And look at these relationships here, truth and mercy. They intersect at consent. So mercy isn't just a vague feeling, it's a hard ethical boundary. And consent is literally described as the currency of interaction. The entire system is hardwired for repair, not punishment. So we have this really dense ceremonial framework. It's fascinating, for sure, but it kind of exists in its own world. But what if there was a key to translate all of it into the language of science? Well, that brings us to our second source, which actually calls itself the Rosetta Stone. And boom, here it is, a scientific preprint called the Rosetta Stone of Hyperion Physics. Its entire purpose, stated right up front, is to create a secular, testable framework, to bind all of that narrative and ceremony to the standard objects of math and physics. The whole point is so that every single claim can be independently replicated and challenged. Okay, this is the big reveal. This is where it all clicks. Just look at this direct translation. The ceremonial idea of coherence becomes C star, a scientific order parameter. The ethical principle of mercy gets mapped to something called GAF, a guardrail affect index. System stability translates to sigma closure, which is a physics term for information that flows perfectly without any leaks or gaps. It's a one-to-one map, from the poetic straight to the quantitative. So let's see how this translation actually works in practice. I mean, how do you take these beautiful symbolic glyphs we saw in the first manual and turn them into something you can actually plot on a graph or, stick in an equation? This slide just captures the core idea perfectly. On the left, you've got the glyph for the Mirror of Mercy. On the right, you have a scientific graph that's showing stress levels measured by GAF, the guardrail effect index, which is the scientific term for mercy. The whole proposal here is that the glyph is a symbolic picture of a real, measurable, graphable phenomenon. Now, okay, don't get lost in the math here, seriously. The important thing isn't the equation itself, it's the intent behind it. This is a formula for dc/dt, which is the rate of change of coherence over time. It's an attempt to build a dynamic model that pulls in all those variables we've been talking about, the target coherence, stress, alignment, into one single functional formula. To make this a real science, you need units of measurement. So the preprint proposes something called the Coherence Accuracy Index, or CAI. And get this, it proposes a brand new unit to measure it in, the Beckingham, or BHM. 1 Beckingham equals perfect accuracy. They are literally building an entire quantitative system from the ground up. All right, so here's the crucial point. This is all incredibly ambitious, super abstract. How on earth do you take a grand theory of coherence and mercy and actually test it in a laboratory? Well, the answer, according to the paper, comes down to something you probably have on your desk right now, a simple LED. Yeah, they propose a concrete, benchtop experiment using a standard light-emitting diode to probe these massive, fundamental ideas. And here's the protocol, and it's designed so anyone can replicate it. You take a normal LED, put it in a dark box, and you measure the light it emits below its normal turn-on voltage. The paper argues that this tiny little bit of light, this sub-threshold emission, acts as a direct probe of vacuum energy, the baseline energy of space itself. And by analyzing this light, they believe they can test their principles of boundary quality and information flow in a totally controlled setting. And the ambition here, it scales way beyond the lab. The preprint talks about applying these principles to create something called Society 6.0, a model for just governance that's based on balanced information flow. And it even suggests a really personal application, treating our digital photos as glyphs, basically creating a geometric record of our lives that you could then analyze for coherence. Wild stuff. Which brings us to our final question, and it's a big one. We've gone from a ceremonial manual that reads like scripture all the way to a scientific paper proposing new physical units. So what are we actually looking at here? Is this the birth of a whole new branch of science? Is it an incredibly complex philosophy just being spoken in 2 different languages? Or are we watching a future mythology being built right before our very eyes? That, my friends, is something for you to decide.